During a rainy night, a mysterious woman in a wheelchair shows up at a museum and points out a masterpiece that disappeared decades ago. But her silent tragedy hides a secret no one expected to be revealed. How are her tears and this work of art connected? The rain drummed relentlessly against the tall windows of the museum, the sound a steady, somber rhythm in the near-empty building. Michael, the night security guard, gazed back in his chair, gazing at the flickering monitors that displayed the dimly lit galleries. It was a quiet night, like so many others, until movement on one of the screens caught his attention. A woman in a wheelchair had entered the gallery housing the museum's collection of portraits. Her figure was shrouded in a thin, soaked coat, her hands gripping the wheels of her chair as she slowly made her way toward the far end of the room. Michael frowned. Visitors were strictly prohibited at this hour. How had she gotten in? He grabbed his flashlight and headed for the gallery. As he approached, he could hear the faint squeak of the wheelchair's tires on the polished floor, punctuated by the occasional drip of rainwater from her coat. Michael cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle her. "Ma'am, the museum is closed for the night," he said. The woman turned her head sharply toward him. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and brimming with tears. She said nothing, only raised a trembling hand to point at one of the paintings on the wall. Michael followed her gaze to the portrait in question, a stunning depiction of a woman in a flowing emerald dress, her expression serene but haunting. It was one of the museum's prized pieces, a work known as the Silent Muse. The artist's name, however, was a mystery. Only a cryptic note on the plaque beneath it alluded to its origins. The woman in the wheelchair let out a strangled, guttural sound, a desperate attempt to communicate. She pointed at the painting again, her fingers trembling. Michael moved closer, his unease growing. Her reaction to the portrait was intense, almost visceral. He noticed her hands shaking as they rested on her lap, her breath hitching with suppressed sobs. Are you trying to tell me something about the painting?" Michael asked cautiously. She nodded, her head jerking forward with urgency. Slowly, she reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Michael hesitated before taking it, his curiosity outweighing his caution. The paper was worn and yellowed with age, the edges frayed. As he unfolded it, he realized it was a photograph of the very same painting, but there was something different. In the bottom corner, scrawled in a neat, faded hand, was a name: Eleanor Harrison. Michael's eyes darted from the photograph to the woman. "Is this your name?" he asked softly. Her lips quivered, and she nodded again, her tears spilling over. Michael's chest tightened as the pieces began to click into place. Eleanor Harrison wasn't just pointing at the painting out of admiration. She was claiming it. He glanced back at the photograph, then at the plaque under the painting. There was no mention of Eleanor Harrison, no hint of who the artist might have been. His gaze returned to the woman, who was now gesturing desperately, her silent pleas echoing louder than any words could have. Michael felt the weight of something far bigger than himself settling over the quiet gallery. "Wait here," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's tear-streaked face remained fixed on the painting as Michael turned and hurried out of the room. There were records, archives of every piece in the museum's collection. If the painting had truly been hers, there had to be something, some trace of her name that had been erased. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Who was Eleanor Harrison, and why had her name disappeared from history? The rain continued its relentless drumbeat against the windows as Michael made his way to the museum's archive, the photograph burning a hole in his hand. Something about this night felt heavy with secrets, and he wasn't sure he was ready for what he was about to uncover. The faint hum of the archive's fluorescent lights greeted Michael as he stepped into the cold, sterile room. Rows of metal shelves stretched before him, each filled with meticulously labeled files. He set the photograph on the desk, its edges curling slightly under the weight of its years, and began to sift through the museum's records. Michael started with the obvious, the file on the Silent Muse. The painting had been part of the collection for over 30 years, donated by a private collector named Martin Foster. Foster was a name he recognized, an influential curator who had built a reputation as a tastemaker in the art world. But as Michael flipped through the papers, a strange detail struck him. The painting's provenance was sparse. Aside from Foster's name and the year it entered the collection, there was nothing to suggest where the piece had come from or who had created it. He frowned, flipping back through the pages. Most paintings came with detailed records, letters of authenticity, correspondence between the museum and the donor, appraisals. But this file felt incomplete, as though someone had deliberately omitted key information. Michael's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of wheels on the floor. He turned to see Eleanor in the doorway, her eyes shadowed but determined. She had followed him here, refusing to let the matter rest. Her presence filled the room with a quiet tension, her silent plea lingering in the air. "I'm looking," Michael said softly, holding up the file as though to reassure her. "But there's not much here. Did Foster take this from you?" Eleanor's jaw tightened, and she shook her head slowly, then pointed to the desk where the photograph rested. She tapped her chest, then gestured to the painting in the image. "You painted it," Michael guessed, his voice cautious. Her nod was slow, deliberate. Then, with shaky hands, she began to sign something, her fingers moving with a fluidity that belied her fragile appearance. Michael watched helplessly, unable to understand, until she stopped and gestured to a notepad on the desk. He handed it to her, along with a pen, and she began to write in uneven, trembling script. "He stole it from me." The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He stared at the paper, then at Eleanor, whose eyes blazed with a fire that had been dulled by years of silence. Her hand moved again, scrawling more words below the first. "Foster ruined me. Said I forged it, took everything." Michael's throat tightened as the gravity of her story began to unfold. Foster, the celebrated curator, had not only stolen her work, but destroyed her reputation in the process. It explained the gaps in the painting's record, the absence of her name. Whoever she had been before, Foster had erased her, leaving only the painting behind as a trophy of his theft. "But why didn't you—" Michael stopped himself, realizing the insensitivity of the question. It was clear that Eleanor's voice had been taken from her, along with so much else. Her body bore the weight of years of suffering, and yet here she was, demanding to be heard. He returned to the file, searching for anything that could corroborate her claim. Finally, buried at the bottom, he found a faded receipt, one issued by Foster to a private gallery. The signature was his, bold and unmistakable, but the description of the painting made Michael's heart race. "Untitled, by unknown artist. Purchased under dispute." "Dispute?" Michael murmured, glancing up at Eleanor. "Did you try to fight him?" She nodded, but the pain in her expression spoke volumes. Whatever fight she had mounted, she had lost. Foster's power in the art world had been too great, and she had been cast aside, her work stripped of her name. Michael folded the receipt and slid it into his pocket. "This isn't over," he said, his voice firm. "If what you're saying is true, there has to be more. I'll find it." Eleanor's eyes softened, her rigid posture easing slightly as though a burden had shifted, if only slightly. She reached for the notepad again and wrote 2 final words before handing it back to him. "Thank you." Michael nodded, but the weight of her gratitude felt misplaced. The real work was just beginning, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the secrets buried in this museum were far darker than he'd anticipated. Together, they left the archive, the photograph and receipt in hand, ready to confront the past that had stolen Eleanor's future. Michael couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. The evidence he had found so far pointed to a pattern of deceit, but it was still fragmentary. Eleanor's story felt painfully real, and yet he knew that exposing the truth would require more than a faded photograph and a cryptic receipt. As they returned to the gallery, her wheelchair squeaking softly against the marble floors, Michael made up his mind to dig deeper. The rain outside had subsided into a faint drizzle, and the muted light from the street lamps cast elongated shadows across the room. Eleanor wheeled herself back to the silent muse, her hands brushing against the edges of the painting's ornate frame. Her silent reverence for the work was palpable, her connection to it undeniable. Michael stood beside her, his gaze flickering between the painting and the woman who claimed to have created it. He pulled out the receipt from his pocket and studied it again. The word dispute lingered in his mind, gnawing at his curiosity. There had to be more, something Foster had tried to hide. "Wait here," Michael said softly, though he doubted Eleanor had any intention of leaving the painting's side. He retraced his steps to the archive, this time searching for files on Foster himself. It didn't take long to find them. The man's influence over the museum had been vast, his name attached to countless acquisitions. Yet as Michael flipped through the records, he began to notice an unsettling pattern. Several works listed under Foster's donations lacked proper documentation, their origins vague or disputed. It wasn't just the silent muse. Foster had built his career on ambiguity, on pieces whose histories were suspiciously incomplete. Then he found it. An inventory list from over 30 years ago, detailing items from a private gallery that had gone bankrupt. The silent muse was on the list, but it wasn't called that then. Scribbled beside the painting's description was a different title, Elegy for Silence. The name Eleanor Harrison was written faintly in parentheses, as though someone had intended to record the artist's identity but thought better of it. Michael's pulse quickened. This was it. A tangible connection between the painting and Eleanor. But why had her name been erased? He sifted through more papers until he stumbled upon a handwritten memo, its edges yellowed with age. The memo was signed by Foster himself. The artist poses a liability. Discredit her publicly to avoid further disputes. Rename the work before acquisition is finalized. Michael stared at the words, his stomach churning with anger. Foster hadn't just stolen the painting. He had orchestrated a campaign to destroy Eleanor's reputation. He had buried her name beneath layers of lies, ensuring she could never reclaim what was rightfully hers. Gripping the memo tightly, Michael returned to the gallery. Eleanor looked up as he approached, her expression guarded but hopeful. He handed her the paper, watching as her eyes scanned the words. Her hands trembled, and she pressed the memo to her chest, her breath hitching in a silent sob. "This proves it," Michael said, his voice low but steady. "He knew it was yours. He knew, and he made sure no one else would." Eleanor nodded, her tear-filled eyes meeting his. She reached for the notepad on her lap and scribbled a single question. What now? Michael hesitated. The museum had a reputation to protect, and confronting its past would undoubtedly spark controversy, but the evidence was damning, and Eleanor deserved justice. "We show them the truth," he said finally. "No more hiding, no more silence." Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest smile, a glimmer of hope breaking through her pain. For the first time in decades, her story was beginning to resurface. The canvas that Foster had tried to erase was once again bearing her name, and Michael vowed to ensure it stayed that way. But as they prepared to take their findings to the museum's board, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this battle was far from over. Foster might be gone, but the system that had enabled his deception still loomed large. The truth was on their side, but whether it would be enough to dismantle the lies remained to be seen. The next morning, the museum's boardroom was tense, filled with the heavy silence of anticipation. Michael stood at the front of the room, the damning evidence laid out on the long oak table before him, the photograph, the receipt, the inventory list, and Foster's incriminating memo. Eleanor sat beside him, her wheelchair positioned purposefully at his side. Her presence alone was a silent accusation, her story written in the weight of her gaze and the trembling grip of her hands on the notepad resting in her lap. The board members, a mix of older men and women who had long benefited from the institution's polished reputation, exchanged uneasy glances. At the head of the table sat Margaret Reed, the museum's director. Her sharp features and tightly pressed lips betrayed no emotion as she surveyed the items Michael had presented. "Mr. Harris," she began, her voice calm but clipped, "these are serious accusations. You're claiming that one of our most celebrated donors built his legacy on theft and deceit. That's a bold assertion to make." "It's not an assertion," Michael replied firmly. "It's the truth. The evidence speaks for itself." He gestured to the memo, now enlarged and displayed on the screen behind him. The words Foster had written decades ago loomed large, impossible to ignore. Margaret's eyes flicked toward the screen, her fingers tightening around the pen she held. "This memo," Michael continued, "proves that Martin Foster knowingly erased Eleanor Harrison's name from her own work, Elegy for Silence. He not only stole her painting but destroyed her reputation, ensuring she could never challenge his claim." Margaret glanced at Eleanor, who met her gaze with unflinching determination. The board members whispered among themselves, their skepticism beginning to waver under the weight of the evidence. "And this," Michael said, holding up the receipt, "shows that the painting was acquired under false pretenses. Foster labeled it a dispute to cover his tracks. He knew the truth and buried it." One of the board members, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. "Even if this is true," he said cautiously, "Foster is no longer here to defend himself. What do you expect us to do now?" Michael's jaw tightened. "I expect you to do the right thing. Acknowledge Eleanor as the rightful artist and restore her name to her work. This painting has been hanging in your gallery for decades, celebrated under a false narrative. It's time to correct that." The room fell into a heavy silence. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes studying Michael and Eleanor as though weighing the consequences of their request. Finally, she spoke. "Reattributing a painting of this significance would spark a scandal. The museum's reputation—" "Your reputation is already at stake," Michael interrupted. His voice, though calm, carried an edge that cut through the room. "If you don't act now, this story will come out another way. The public deserves to know the truth." Margaret's lips thinned, but before she could respond, Eleanor reached for her notepad. Slowly, deliberately, she wrote a single sentence and held it up for everyone to see. "My name is Eleanor Harrison, and this is my art." The room seemed to hold its breath. Margaret's gaze lingered on the words before she let out a long, measured sigh. "Very well," she said at last. "We will convene a public press conference to announce the reattribution of the Silent Muse to Eleanor Harrison. The museum will issue a formal apology for the oversight and provide a detailed account of its discovery." Eleanor's eyes glistened with tears as she nodded, her hand gripping the edge of the table for support. Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he knew this victory was just the beginning. 2 weeks later, the museum's largest gallery was packed with journalists, art enthusiasts, and curious onlookers. The painting now bore its original title, Elegy for Silence, with a new plaque beneath it, crediting Eleanor Harrison as its creator. Eleanor sat in her wheelchair near the front, her posture straight, her head held high. Michael watched as the museum director delivered the official announcement, her words a mix of contrition and celebration. But the moment that truly mattered came when Eleanor was wheeled to the microphone. Her assistant handed her a notepad, and she held it up to the crowd. The message clear and simple. "Thank you for hearing me." The audience erupted into applause, the sound reverberating through the gallery like a heartbeat. Michael glanced at Eleanor, who was smiling now, her tears flowing freely but without sadness. For the first time in decades, her silence had been broken, not by words, but by the undeniable truth of her art. As the crowd dispersed, Michael stood by the painting, studying it anew. It was no longer just a masterpiece. It was a testament to resilience, a triumph over injustice. And in its beauty, the world would finally see not only the skill of its creator, but the strength of her spirit. What would you have done if you uncovered a story like Eleanor's? Share your thoughts, subscribe for more powerful tales, and let's keep the conversation alive.